So I'll begin. You have a handout. The illustration is for the second part of the talk. We can look at that later. Anyone who takes an interest in Old Irish poetry will soon encounter the famous verse on the storm at sea, given on the handout under item 1. This is written on the margin of a 9th century manuscript containing a copy of Priscian's Latin grammar, and has been in the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland since the early Middle Ages. The translation is Kearney's, from Kearney's Early Irish Lyrics, in item 2 of the handout, and he does his best in this anthology to capture something of the metre of the and rhyme system of the original. So he has the metre Devida, and he has the rhyming couplets tonight, white, ease, and seas. Of course, it could hardly be otherwise, right? Since marginal verses such as this one, along with lyrical and nature poems, are the stuff of modern anthologies of early Irish verse. And I list some on the number 2 on the handout: Gerard Murphy's Early Irish Lyrics, James Kearney's Medieval Irish Lyrics, and David Green and Frank O'Connor's Golden Treasury of Irish Poetry. These all have the original text and translations. There are others, of course, that just have translations. The criteria for selection in these anthologies have even been applied to Turnhausen's Old Irish Reader, which can hardly be said to be intended for the general reader. While he rightly restricted his selection of texts to those found in manuscripts written before 900 AD, this cannot be the explanation for confining his selection of verse to the marginal verses on the storm at sea, the scribe out of doors, and the vanity of pilgrimage, as a poem put into the mouth of Sibna Gel, Mad Sweeney, and the very well-known poem on the scholar and his cat. Thus, for example, the earliest surviving manuscript copy of a praise poem in Irish, most recently edited by Tomás Ó Cahasa, on the handout there, is, and in studio appropriately, for the festschrift for Daniel Melia, is not included, although it's found in the same manuscript as the poem on the cat. Indeed, even if we leave aside the large corpus of Old Irish verse preserved in later manuscripts and confine ourselves to manuscripts written before 900, the greater part of this narrower corpus consists of the praise poem, a religious poem in the same manuscript, and the 2 substantial riddling poems in the Milan Codex. In one of his last contributions to scholarship before his untimely death, Anders Alquist aptly used the word forgotten of these last 2 poems, and one can only hope that its imminent publication will encourage scholars to pay due attention to them again. Now, the problem with the selections made in all these anthologies is that they tend to create a false impression of the nature of early medieval Irish verse compositions. As Elizabeth Boyle in the last item on that handout, number 2, in writing about anthologies, stated, one serious consequence of the exclusion of other more common forms of Irish poetry which is didactic, pedagogic, genealogical, cosmological, political, or historiographical, to give just a few examples, is that it contributes to a romanticised and sentimental view of medieval Irish poets as nature-loving, conservative, and in many cases only superficially Christian. Verses such as the first one cited on the handout give the impression of being spontaneous compositions, an impression which is reinforced by the contrast between the Latin of the central text and the Irish of the marginal verse. But the more one reads marginal verses, the more one begins, at least I do, to wonder how typical the verses chosen for anthologies are of marginal verses as a whole. Now, the first problem with undertaking a general survey of these verses is that they have been, and the only way to put it is, marginalised. The closest to a comprehensive study is O'Rahilly's publication in 1921 of Breatnach. It's on the list at the last page of the handout. This, however, is based mainly on manuscripts of the 18th and 19th century. These are late, right? But not only is it not confined to marginal verses, they're not all marginal verses, but it's also often impossible to make out from O'Rahilly's notes what exactly his sources were. Now, in manuscript catalogues, usually no more than the first line is cited, and in most cases, for example, the manuscripts in the Royal Irish Academy, Oxford, and the British Library, they are indexed. For the Royal Irish Academy manuscripts, however, the marginal verses are not consistently noted, and for those in Trinity College manuscripts, they're hardly ever noted, and there's no index. Systematic editions of all the marginal verses in a particular manuscript, such as those noted in the handout under 3 and 5, are especially rare. And the first one there, Beatrice Culverwell, I think, has this ranks, or is a candidate anyway, for one of the most overlooked scholars in Old Irish and overlooked publications indeed. But we'll come back to that later. In the case of the diplomatic editions of Laud na Hire and the Book of Leinster, the marginal verses are edited, right, but without translation amongst the footnotes. There's a lot. If you pay close attention to the footnotes, you'll find a lot of marginal verses in those two manuscripts. The most common approach, however, is to edit a selection of marginal verses, and some instances of such selections are made by Cunamar or noted, listed on the handout under 3 there. Now, in my talk this evening, I want to confine myself to looking at some of the principal characteristics of marginal verses, their subject matter and possible sources, and then go on to making some observations on the practice of making compilations of these verses in later medieval manuscripts. Now, the first thing we may note is that the practice of writing verses on the margins of manuscripts is already established in the Old Irish period, that is before 900 AD. And as far as I know, all of those in manuscripts of the Old Irish period have been published by now. But interestingly, 2 verses, perhaps both because they're in rare metres, perhaps also because they had religious and didactic themes, were overlooked for a long time. These are given on the handout under 4 there. One of the examples and the reference to the other one. So the first was printed as prose in the Thesaurus Paleo Hibernicus, amongst the glosses on the Karlsruhe manuscript of St. Augustine Soliloquia, and was first identified as verse by James Kearney. The second, again, was printed as prose in the Thesaurus Paleo Hibernicus, and was first identified as verse by Breatnach, as detailed on the handout. This metre there, this is Kearney's one, and Kearney has very neatly got the metrical pattern of the Irish and transferred it into the English translation. It's a rare metre because it's got 3 syllables in the first line, then 2 heptasyllabic lines, the first one ending in a trisyllable, the second ending a disyllable, and then the last line rhymes with the first. And this is brought out by Cardy's translation, where he has evil rhyming with demon, and this will make perfect rhyme according to the rules of Irish rhyme, and then righteousness at the end of the third line, capturing the pattern of the trisyllable. Okay, so of the other early marginal verses, I've got the references there on the handout, edited in Thesaurus Paleo Hibernicus 290 and 296. Right. The main text in all these manuscripts is in Latin, although 3 of these 4 manuscripts also contain Old Irish glosses on the Latin text. The earliest surviving manuscripts where both the main text and the marginal verses are in the vernacular belong to the Middle Irish period, and such manuscripts are numerous in subsequent centuries. Nevertheless, the practice of writing marginal verses in Irish in Latin manuscripts continues into the Middle Irish period. As for example, these are item number 5 in the handout, the Gospel book Harley 1802, written out Armagh, can be closely dated to, I think it's 1138, and the Drummond Missal. In the latter case, the verses may have been added as late as the 14th century. Now, another remarkable feature of marginal verses is the fact that they tend to circulate, to get recycled, with many of them recurring in 2 manuscripts and some in 3 or more. A particularly frequently recurring verse is that on the handout number 6 there, Imba Madan, Imba Fuen. It's a long list there of the verses, the manuscripts in which that appears as a marginal verse. Well, you have the translation there in the box, Imba Madan, Imba Fuen. Whether morning or evening, on land or at sea, though I know I shall die, alas, I know not when. Well, interestingly, one of the Harley 5280 version of that, he got probably fed up with the having seen this very many times before, and he replaces the Irish in the third line, Rachad, I will go, replaces that with the Latin future, Ibo, which has the same number of syllables. Okay, so these, there are many other such examples, and I've confined myself to two examples on the handout there, the next page. This one here, you get four that I've identified so far, that is, I haven't managed to survey all of the marginal verses. This is one about Marg Kungas Ni Aracharet, woe to anyone who asks a friend for something. And the second one is Marg Brett of Beresvoy, woe to the judge who delivers a false judgment. Okay. Now, there are many more such instances, and these are from manuscripts, all of these are from manuscripts of 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Clearly, only the earliest attestation in any of these cases could possibly be an original composition by the scribe of that manuscript, and it may not be, even that might have been copied from somewhere else. Now, some marginal verses in Old Irish and Middle Irish manuscripts reappear in manuscripts of the post-Norman period. And in doing so, they're not only do they pass over the historical watershed of the Norman invasion, but also the geographical boundary of the Irish Sea. Thus, the verses noted on the handout under 7 are found in two manuscripts which have been on the continent since the early Middle Ages, but both recur in manuscripts of the post-Norman period in Ireland. As it is virtually impossible that the later copies could have been taken from the manuscripts after they were moved to the continent on two separate occasions, two far removed places, either the verses were copied before both manuscripts were moved, so it happened twice, or the ultimate source of all the copies must be a manuscript or manuscripts which remained for at least some time in Ireland. In other words, the verses in the continental manuscripts are not necessarily original to those manuscripts. Examples from earlier manuscripts which survived until the present day, or at least until recent centuries in Ireland, are more numerous, and I give a selection on the handout. The first one there is it's in the Codex Palatino Vaticanus, and in the Lauerbach. Sorry, that's a continental manuscript, and it's about the calculation of how long Adam lived and then how long Eve lived after him, 930 years. The other one, the next one, is a little jingle, which is found in the margin of the Book of Leinster and recurs in the National Library of Ireland manuscript G3. Rabith os la Tadach Maccain la hos Rabith. La hos Rabith Tadach Maccain a ros Narich. The next one, number 9 on the handout, has a particularly long life indeed. The earliest attestation is in the late 12th century Book of Leinster, and then it appears in the early 15th century, Laud 610, and I've given the translation there in the box, and it finally appears in Keating's Trí Beorachtaí an Bháis, where it's moved back into the core text in on the page. Okay, so that has a particularly long life. Now, at this point, two important conclusions can be drawn. The first is that there is a real possibility that further marginal verses in later manuscripts may be as early as the Old Irish period, highly likely. And the second is that we cannot assume that just because a verse is found in the margin of a manuscript, it is likely to represent a spontaneous composition on the part of the scribe. These 2 points are confirmed by the fact that on occasion we can identify marginal verses which have been excerpted from longer poems, So the examples on the handout extend from the Old Irish period to the early Modern Irish period. So the first one there is from one of the poems edited by James Carney in the volume, The Poems of Bloodhook. But this is the poem on the Virgin Mary, which is not actually by Bloodhook, but it's in the same manuscript. And we have one verse of that on the margins of H317 TCD manuscript, and you can see that the first few letters are worn, but you can see that it's a version of verse 4 of this poem edited by Carney, and I get the Carney's text and his translation. I think, as far as I know, that is the only verse of any of those poems that have been edited in that volume that is actually attested or cited elsewhere that can be identified. Examples from Middle Irish texts, i.e. verses being excerpted from Middle Irish texts and appearing in the margins, I have given there in the next page in the handout, and some early modern Irish verse that Lara Bragg has cites on page 196. It cites verse 28 of a poem by Guthrie Tionól, or a poem from a piece of translation literature actually finds its way into the margin of Lot 615. And particularly striking in this regard are the verses extracted from grammatical and metrical tracts. Right? This is, as far away as nature poetry and storms at sea and all the rest of it that you can get. So there's this one from the text, the first one there, the text on how many are the divisions of satire in 23 Q10. A metrical from a metrical glossary again in 23 Q10, or most subbase, that's explaining words, defining Latin words in Irish in HC 17. And then even an example, last one there is an example from the Irish grammatical tracts, cited as a marginal verse again in H3 17. Yet another category of marginal verse which belongs with learned verse and is highly unlikely to be a spontaneous composition on the part of the scribe, are the verses which use rare words and supply explanatory glosses. So you have some marginal verses be written in the margin, and they'll have super linear glosses explaining the difficult words attached to them. So the example that's a nice one there is number 12 on the handout, is previously unpublished, as one of many instances of verses complaining about a miserly host. So in Cult Crane, there are two copies of this, right, both as marginal verses. And if that word cult, which is a rare word for food, in the other manuscript, that's glossed as well. But you have these superscript glosses then explaining Breatnach as a remainder. I've tried to get this into the English translation. The miserly food which is given to the ravenous poet, although done cloak and then glossed as i.e. a wren, is a small avian, i.e. a bird. It would not leave behind any residue, i.e. leftovers when departing. Right? Not enough to feed a wren is and two more examples of this learned verse are on page under number 13 there. Again taken from H317. In both cases, the main text on the page is are law texts. Right? But the marginal verses are, the first one is about the dimensions of Noah's Ark, right? And the second one is about Adam's, the lifespan of Adam, right? And then Eve afterwards. Sorry, the other one was just about how long Eve lived after Adam. This has got the lifespan of both of them. Okay, now in some cases there is an obvious connection between the subject matter of the main text and that of the marginal verse. Now I've already noted in the handout under where you can identify sources under Middle Irish there, so that item 10 in the handout, a variant of verse 13 of the poem I'm editing in the next volume in the Irish manuscript series, produced by the Academy, the Book of Ivana. There's a verse on the Kirvara, or comb maker, in that poem, which also appears as a marginal verse in the manuscript G3. The place where it appears is at the bottom of the page in a copy of Urquhart Beg, the text on status, and the main text is actually talking about the Kirvara, the comb maker. So you have this verse then attached to the page, which is talking about the comb maker. However, as it is taken from a longer poem, right? So citing it in G3 shows that such verses are not necessarily composed in response to the scribe coming across a term like Kirvara in the main text. On the other hand, the item 14 on the handout, it's a verse in the Larbrack on the places where John the Baptist was beheaded and buried. It's added in the margin under a prose account of the Passion of John the Baptist, and it is so close in wording to the prose that it must represent, which is just a few lines above in the main part of in the column, right, in the main part of the text. And I've underlined there, you have the verse first and the parallels, and especially parallel is the use of that fairly rare word, fiich, meaning village or district. So, and it's anim in icha is in the verse and it's in the prose. So it's highly likely that this verse is a direct versification of the passage in the prose text about John the Baptist. The other one then is also has a very close the verse. It's about Martin of Tours, and his giving his parents' names, and that appears again in the lower margin, and the main text on that page is the life of Martin, the Middle Irish translation of the life of Martin of Tours. So that has a very close. I also refer then and the handout to a paper by Patrick Ford on this topic in general, which also suggests an ingenious connection between the margin and the main text in the case of marginal verse in the St. Gall Priscian. Now, I will finish this survey of some of the main characteristics with the observation that the distribution of these verses in some manuscripts gives the impression of a planned layout. For example, the 6 verses in this is handout 15, the 6 verses on the bottom of folio 46 of the Harley 5280 are written in and out of one another in a curious, intricate pattern. They're like a double figure of 8. And an instance of a different kind is the RIA manuscript, the Book of Fina. At the bottom of each side of folios 2 to 10, there are 2 verses, right? Except for the first and last where there's only 1. So you have, in the majority of cases, every single bottom of every page you have a pair of verses. This looks like it's planned layout. It forms part of the decoration of the book. I cite there two verses which are, I think, well known anyway. Well, they should be well known from the translation by John Kelleher there. This is about Cuchebna of Iona, who died in 747. These two belong together as a unit, yet they're spread over 2 separate pages. So it gives the impression that that the scribe had gathered together a set of verses that he wanted to put in on the margins of the page. These 2 verses naturally belong together, but because of the way that writing proceeded, he ended up spreading them over 2 pages. But I'll return to this question later. Now, I've already commented on marginalisation of marginal verses, and this applies all the more to the very term for marginal verse in Irish. Number 16 on the handout, I cite, and the reference there, you get the further details of where these are from 17th century manuscripts by Micheál Gleda, in which he talks about, the first one he talks about, he's transcribing the Ran Varabán an Chéad Bhrollaigh den Éileadh, the marginal verses of the prologue to the Féidir. And the second one is the Ran Marabán agus Chinish Sin, those marginal, translate that as contiguous. Knes is skin, right? Now, there is the page from the page 88 of the Laura Brack on the handout, and that's from the second part. Second page, they're each a folio for every month, right? And this is the second part of the saints, the calendar for the month of May, and you have the main text, Old Irish text, in the middle, and you have then commentary, glosses and commentary, and so on, all attached closely to the main text, and they're marked off by little white lines forming boxes, right? These, and many of these things in the smaller script, they have verses. They consist of prose, anecdotes about the saints, but also verses. They're the ran chnish, right, the ones that are closely attached to the name. This page also has marginal verses. They're entirely separate, right, from all the rest of them. There's one at the bottom and one at the top. They're the ran varvan, right, the marginal verses. And there's no headword marvan, margin, in DIL, but under margan, M-A-R-G-A-N, are some examples which are described as misspellings. Now, at the time of writing that paper in 2007, I was unaware of the example given on the handout on 16 from James Kearney's edition of the Poems of the Butlers, which is Art Moran gon ran alle ni frith far do honere a grach bui von Barlan Kyle Dun ach Marvan and Vamref, so the margin of the parchment. And that is the perfect distillation of a praise poem. He's praised, the patron's praise for his physical beauty and bringing fertility to the land. It's a single verse composition. This has all the marks of being, this is the original composition, and he's talking about placing it. He composed it to place it in the margin. This is not copied from somewhere else. There's a useful, by the way, discussion by Pádraig Ó Mac, which I referred to there on the handout, of the concept of the single verse composition. Right? He says that it is, argues that it was, at least in the classical modern Irish period, more common than previously thought. Anyway, the margin, in the notes then, Kearney explains this word marvan. His edition came out after fasciculus M for the dictionary. He says, so he corrects the dictionary, and he says that it's not a misspelling, but that it's a blend of margan, margin, and bon, white, right, to give you the new word marvan. Right. Now, I now suggest that an even earlier example can be added to these. This is in a verse in a poem by Gilna Naomh Mac Éagáin, who died in 1309, and it's given there on the handout. The edition there takes it as memorised all stanzas of the well-wrought poems of the dead. Now, this is cited as a marginal verse in 23Q10, where the spelling is Marvan, and again in G1, National Ireland G1, spelling is Marvan. And then there's a variant of that which takes the second couplet is different. That is taken from verse 3 of the same poem, right, by Gilna Naomh Mac Éagáin. Now, on the basis of these other attestations, I suggest that, propose that we revise the translation of the first line to study every polished marginal verse. Right? The author of the poem, who died in 1309, was a notable legal scholar, and his work has been, and there's an account of his work in the article by Fergus Kelly, who is, of course, working on an edition of one of his law tracts. He gives an account anyway of this poem, noting among other things that it is a poem of 25 stanzas, which summarises the educational needs of a 13th century law student. He recommends for particular study the law text called the Heptads, Nashachta, and he further advises the student to become familiar with texts containing proverbial or gnomic material, such as the teachings of Cormac and the Testament of Moran. My proposed reading of the first line of verse 14 leaves us with an important and relatively early confirmation of the significance of marginal verses in medieval Irish literary culture. And this is from a period, not much longer than, more than a century after the writing of the Book of Leinster. Furthermore, we have in the two variants of the verse in handout 17 there, a verse about marginal verses being extracted from a longer poem and becoming itself a marginal verse. Not only that, but when it is cited in the National Library of Ireland manuscript G1, it is as a part of a compilation of marginal verses which forms the main text of the manuscript at this point, and thus it has been reabsorbed into the centre. This manuscript, however, is a special case. Its dimensions are so small, and that little box in which I give the details is as close as I should get to 6.8 by 5.4 centimetres. That'll give you, you don't fit much. So it's so small that the difference between the centre and the margin becomes irrelevant. Nevertheless, yeah, this brings us conveniently to the question of compilations more generally, so the second part of the paper. And marginal verses did not always begin in the margins, and neither did they always remain there. They could be collected together and form the main text on the page. Under 2A on the handout, I give an account of a compilation which clearly signals that it's, or marks that it is a collection of separate verses. And that's this, your separate handout, and the printed handout there gives a list of the contents of that. Now, what this does is you see this down here, for example, thing that looks like a Q with 4 strokes coming out on the right-hand side. This is the paragraph sign, and one of the important functions of the paragraph sign is to mark something as being separate. This is a collection of quatrains. There's some prose items in it. A collection of quatrains, most but not all marked with the Q-like paragraph sign. Some of them were printed, I give the reference there, in Tionól, Mediaeval, in 1910. And this is from TCD manuscript H317. They are all, they clearly are excerpted from a copy of the Failure Oingus, the calendar of Oingus, similar to that in the Larbach there. Which included marginal, so a copy like that in the Larbach, which included marginal verses. The items number 6, I've numbered them all there. I'm moving over to letters, by the way, for the compilations. But under A, item number 6 is actually from the main text, 17th of March, so you know what saint that is. So, and number 13 are taken from the epilogue, from the main text of the Failure Oingus, but almost all the rest recur either in the commentary of the Failure, so here, the stuff in the middle, the Rantnish, right? Or in the margins of the Larbach, so they can be identified in the Larbach. They can't all be identified, and that's why I say it's something like the Larbach. And I've identified all the identifications there. The ones I've printed in bold on the handout, the ones that are actually in the margins, that are also occur in the margins of the Larbach. Now, of a different nature is 2B, the collection of verses in 2B. These were written by Micheál Cléide, so in the 1620s, and published by Tionól. Tionól published the whole lot, and his comment is important there. Fast alle noch der altirischen Periode entstammenden Ramereien. So he recognised that these are almost all of these verses are most of these verses are very early. Right? They're written by Micheál Cléide and published by Tionól. There's a gap between the last 3 verses on the second page. But otherwise, there's no indication given in the manuscript that they are separate verses. But once you start reading, you see that they have, that the subject matter changes. It is clear from his introductory comments that Meyer realised that they were separate, but not so the cataloguer of the Royal Irish Academy, where it's described as in run on the Guineas sub 17 plus 3 quatrains. So it was taken to be a what you may call it, a single composition. Now, I've given one's identifications where I could make them. One of them is also in King's Inns as a marginal verse. The other one, number 2, is the one that's in the Codex Bernensis as a marginal verse, and this is one of the manuscripts that's been on the continent since a very early period. And so anyway. These are clearly a collection, right, of marginal verses. Similar is the compilation in 2C. This is taken from the Book of Ibanez, Here again, the verses are not marked as separate from each other, and it is a different hand from that of the main scribe. Much of it is worn and difficult to read, but you can still make out what's in them, and many of them can be identified, the sources. The last one there recurs in the Drummond Missal as one of the marginal verses in the Drummond Missal. Okay. On the other hand, then, the 2D is the compilation in the Edinburgh manuscript. Each verse is separated from the next by a clear space. There are other such compilations, but here I will have time to look at just two further examples, both written by the 15th century scribe William Marginal. For some account of his work, I've given there, and some references, the last page of the handout. Robin Flower describes him as one of the most prolific scribes of the second half of the 15th century. Nassigny Hayes' further discussion of other manuscripts written by him. He was scribe or part of TCD manuscript H27, which contains Star, Erpel, Agus Avos. As Gordon Quinn, who edited in 1939, it's in the Irish Text Society, volume for 1939. And shows that it is, there are a number of versions of this, but he shows that it's based on Caxton's The Recueil of the Histories of Troy, printed at Bruges, probably in 1474. So it's taken from a printed book, right? And an English translation. Gordon Quinn, anyway, suggests not that Marginal was the actual translator of Star Erpel. Right? And for other instances of translations of, this is a nice one about conflict between periodization, translations of Middle English texts into early modern Irish, contemporaneous, some references by Andrew Breeze there. So it's quite a very interesting figure, and as you will see, even more interesting. Under 2E, I give the compilation. It's a compilation of marginal verses in the British Library manuscript edition 30512 by William Marginal. This is the earliest compilation, right, of verses I've come across so far. It begins in the second column of folio 32, so it starts in the column and goes down to the bottom of the column. Then the verses move into the lower margin and then to the upper margin of the next page. There are two further verses in the lower margins of the second page, but these probably do not belong with the rest. Now, I've tried to replicate there on the handout how they're presented in the manuscript. I've used a paragraph sign from verse 4 onwards. Right? They're accompanied by this paragraph sign in the manuscript. Right? So this, again, serves to mark them as separate. The last two do not. They're not marked by the paragraph sign, and secondly, they belong together. Right? Well, yeah. You see what that is all about. That should be the mother-in-law, yeah. So the. In beginning within the central text of the page and extending into the margins, this is somewhere between a compilation of marginal verses and verses written in the margins. At the same time, most of the verses are clearly marked as separate entities by the use of the paragraph sign. Now, the remarkable thing is that this collection in E corresponds remarkably closely to the set of verses presented in the handout under F, and this brings us back to Beatrice Culverwell, who edited these in Hermetina. I've given the reference under item 3 on the handout. The manuscript was written by Taig U Riordan in 1474, which is the date of the printing of Caxton's work in Bruges. So it's around, in other words, it's written around the same time that William Marginal was active. And you see there, I've given the translations based on Beatrice Culverwell's edition. I've omitted the first one because that's another version of the one that I already translated at the beginning, whether it be morning, whether it be evening. but the rest, right, they're all the correspondence is absolutely remarkable. So the manuscript from which they're taken is section 9 of TCD manuscript page 212, right? And the main text of this manuscript is a copy of the prose version of Salt and the Ram, written by Taigo O'Riordan. The verses are systematically distributed throughout the manuscript, with one verse each in the lower margins of the recto and verso of folios 1 to 5 and the recto of folio 6. Apart from the first three, right, in F, all of these marginal verses appear together, right, in the compilation given as E on the handout. Right? So, at first sight, then you would assume then that the compilation made in E, it just taken it. He went through them all and just copied them in and put them all together from this manuscript. The dates fit, right? The one argument against this, however, is the fact that E has nothing corresponding to the first three verses in F. You know, if he was going to collect them, why didn't he collect them all from F? But an even stronger argument is the fact that the last line of verse number 9 in F is missing, right? Whereas in E, Macula's copy, it's present, right? So it is conceivable that Macula might have supplied the missing line from another source. I mean, Beatrice Culverwell, for example, in her edition, supplied the missing line from a copy in the Laur Brac. Right? So it's possible, but this might be stretching the argument a bit too far. On the other hand, the verses in F can hardly have been taken from the compilation in E as it stands, given that the reading of the third line in verse F6 is superior to that in E4. So the superior reading cannot derive from the inferior reading in E4. What cannot be denied, however, is that there is a close connection between E and F, and one possibility is that both could derive from a third source. Whether we postulate this to have been a set of marginal verses in another manuscript or a compilation of such verses already in existence, we are still left with tangible instance of a close relationship between a set of marginal verses in one manuscript and a compilation of them all, bringing them all together in another manuscript. All this in turn then gives us a possible clue as to the purpose of such compilations. Could they perhaps have been intended to serve as convenient stores of verses to be drawn on to provide marginal ornamentation when the occasion arose? This is at least a possibility. And the regular distribution of marginal verses in some manuscripts, such as the Book of Fenna, as I mentioned above, as well as the manuscript in F, certainly give the impression that they formed an essential part of the planning of the layout of the book. In the case of Mícheál Uí Chaoimh, his work was a work of salvage and part of a programme of transcribing text from a very extensive programme of transcribing text from earlier manuscripts. In section 16 of the handout, I refer to his transcription of marginal verses from the Phaedra, where he clearly indicated what he was doing. On the other hand, his compilation in section 2b of the handout has no heading, and he does not mark the verses as separate. As Meyer noted, the language of many of these verses is earlier, and it is reasonable to conclude that they represent a transcription of the marginal verses in an early manuscript which is now lost, or given the gap in the manuscript between the first 17 verses and the final 3 verses, maybe from 2 separate manuscripts. It is unlikely, however, that Uí intended to deceive the reader into thinking that they form a single poem of 20 verses or even 2 of 17 and 3 verses, respectively. The same cannot be said of all of the work of Iliam Macula, the scribe of the compilation in handout E. While he was not unique in bringing separate verses together, I know of at least 2 cases where he went a step further, brought a number of marginal verses together and passed off these compilations as unitary compositions. The first is under 2G on the handout. This is again from additional 30512. I've translated the verses in boxes there just to emphasise or to highlight the fact that the subject matter is entirely different in each verse. But he he presents them together. And Meyer, in this case, I've given a reference to Meyer's edition. Meyer gave it ein Gedicht aus additional. In that case, Meyer presented it as a single composition as well. But as I refer there to Robin Flowers in the catalogue noted, they are really separate, right? And that's clear from the subject matter of them, and also that they are in different metres. Right? Although Macula supplies neither a title nor an inscription, he doesn't say Colum Killick in it or anything like that. He does the next best thing in that he contrives a dunad, right, a closure, marking it off, marking it with as, right. The fact that he puts the as in there after tuas, right, that's the way to indicate that this is the end of the poem, and this is how the last word, putting the as in is a way of saying this is how the last word echoes the first word of the poem. All of this is clearly intended to pass off the 4 verses as belonging to a single poem. I've supplied a translation there, and not only are the verses clearly separate, but the first recurs as a marginal verse in the Book of Fina, the first 2 in the compilation under 2c on the handout, and the last in commentary on Orcach na Negus. Now, in the second case, he goes even further. That's I just referred to it in on the last page of the handout, the first item on the last page of the handout. This is the text edited by, given a heading, Riachel na Manach Liath, and edited by Strahan there in 1905. Strahan edited without a translation. Now, in this case, he goes further and supplies a title. And in a forthcoming work, I will show that the so-called Rule of the Grey Monks is in fact a compilation of marginal verses which vary significantly in date, subject matter, and metre. Macula's work in these instances is as fine an example of compilatory activity, if you want to avoid using the word forgery, by learned scribes as one could ask for. Okay, so I'd like to come to a conclusion now, or some conclusions. From this brief survey of the large corpus of medieval Irish marginal verses, it has emerged that we cannot draw a hard and fast line between the centre and the margins. Not only do individual verses migrate from longer poems into the margins, but also marginal verses can return to the centre, sometimes in very unexpected ways. While the majority... That's great. While the great majority of them are found in manuscripts of the early modern Irish period, it can be shown that a number of them go back to the Old and Middle Irish periods, and it is likely that some, at least, of the rest are also early. They are then of relevance for those concerned with the earlier medieval period, as well as the later medieval and early modern period. Okay. It cannot, of course, be denied that verses such as the one I opened with are fine examples of lyric poetry. And while such verses can be readily appreciated by the modern reader, it is also too easy to be misled into thinking that they are typical of medieval Irish marginal verses. As I hope to have shown in my talk today, marginal verses in their subject matter and range are not all that different from the core verse texts which occupy the central columns of the manuscripts and were a highly regarded element of medieval Irish literary culture.